And hello to everyone who's out there. I'm sorry I'm a little bit late, but I had a minor technical problem because I'm a technical incompetent. Let's just give it a minute or two for people to join us. Hello, Kay. Delighted you're joining us. And Julie, welcome. Who's that? Jill. Let us hope today's lecture is a bit of gas. Shelley, welcome. The names are popping up for me. It comes up differently now than it did on the old line, and so I'm getting them one at a time. There's Catherine. Glad you enjoyed Faith Healer from the old Vic. It is a wonderful, wonderful play. Hello, James. And David in the UK. Johnstown, PA. There we have the UK, Johnstown, PA. We are so international. It is wonderful. Hello from Dublin, Aoife. You didn't reply to my text, but I forgive you. Grace, hello. And Barry. And Jimmy. They're all flooding in now. It hasn't started yet, Julie. You're all right. Thank you, Greg. Hello, David. All these names coming up. All our old friends. There's Dennis from Greensburg. Wouldn't be the same without you, Dennis. There's Rebecca. Welcome. It's like taking the register of class. Bit odd, but it's lovely. It's lovely that you're all out there and that you're all back with us. And I hope you are enjoying this new format that we're using. This new platform. I think I look better, which is always a wonderful thing. And I hope you're all finding it easy to operate without all that business of having to register and all of that nonsense. The easier we can talk to one another in this wonderful technological world we live in, the better. So, welcome to everyone out there. We are going to, I'll start now in a couple of minutes. But first of all, I want to thank everybody yet again who has sent donations. I hate talking about money. And hello, John Henry. I hate talking about the money side of things, but this season that has just gone, and in fact the year we've just gone through, has been difficult for everybody. So for everybody who has sent donations, you have my eternal gratitude. You've all been most generous, and I know I keep asking, but as I say, every single dollar does count. And as we start moving forward into this year, come the fall, we are going to be celebrating 25 seasons of Picked Classic Theatre, and we want to make it something special. So we're going to, husband our resources as carefully as possible, and every donation towards that will make a huge difference to us. So please stay with us. Please give us what you can. Every dollar does count. Enough about that for now. I want to say a word or two about, because last week, it was rather interesting. Last week's webinar on the topic of the power of politics was really about the power of words. And I can't let it go by without saying that what we all witnessed on Wednesday was a perfect example of the power of words working in the other direction. Words, as we all know, brought us an awful lot of unpleasantness and danger. And 1 week later, words brought us a great deal of comfort and support. And in particular, and I know everybody's been talking about her on Facebook and Twitter and just about every other platform, I can't let it go by as a practitioner of the use of words to say, wasn't that girl, Amanda Gorman, amazing? And what was so amazing about it, and if you get it, if you can find it, and it's there online just about everywhere, the piece she read, the poem she read, was such a magnificent use of word structure. It was, to my mind, a perfect demonstration of the power of words in action. And I thought it was glorious. I hope you did. I hope I offend nobody by saying that. But it was extraordinary. She is a remarkable young woman, but she's most remarkable for her command of the use of the power of words. That's the major topic I want to talk about on that. There were a lot of very good speeches, but that poem, to my mind, was everything I was talking about, the use of the word and how powerful it can be. So anyway, today we're going to talk about farce. And my premise is that there is nothing funny about farce, which is a statement that probably needs a little explanation. So I first of all want to get some definitions clear in our minds. And as usual, I turn to the divine Wikipedia, from which I steal facts. I used to go to Encyclopedia Britannica, but it's too heavy. So Wikipedia is a wonderful institution. Wiki tells us, in theatre, I'm quoting, a farce is a comedy that aims at entertaining the audience through situations that are highly exaggerated, extravagant, and thus improbable. That's the first statement in Wiki that I slightly disagree with. Farce is also characterized, I continue to quote, by physical humor, the use of deliberate absurdity or nonsense, and broadly stylized performances. I partly agree with that. I go on. It is also often set in one particular location where all events occur. Sometimes. Historical content, or historical context, I beg your pardon. The term farce, says Wikipedia, is derived from the French word for stuffing. Interesting. In reference to improvisations applied by actors to medieval religious dramas. Now, let us recall in the medieval period, we had most plays performed by most strolling players for politic reasons were on religious topics. And they could be done on the back of a wagon and known as the mystery plays. Some of the cycles, particularly about there are very famous mystery cycles. There's the York cycle, two or three others that have stood the test of time in a way. The Royal Shakespeare, I think it was, did one production of one of the cycles, one of the mystery cycles, and it transferred from a Royal Shakespeare stage to one of the biggest theatres in London's West End and ran for a considerable period of time. So they still work. And we'll be coming back to them at a future webinar. But anyway, later forms of this drama, the farce, were performed as comic interludes during the 15th and 16th centuries, so that you would have a play, it might be a tragedy, followed by a farce to brighten the mood at the end of the evening. Short thing, one act. The earliest farces that can be dated, they're very old. They come from around 1450. And 1450 and thereafter. So the idea of the farce has been around for quite some time. So anyway, back to my premise. There is nothing funny about farce, which of course is not true. My entire premise is false. But, as I always tell you, not everything I tell you may be true. Let's examine what I exactly mean by this particular concept. Nothing funny about farce. It depending, of course, on whether you are watching the farcical situation or actually being the farce yourself. Now, I learned this from my directing mentor, a gentleman called Hilton Edwards. I've mentioned him before on these webinars, but for those of you who weren't here, a quick recap. Hilton Edwards was an Englishman. He was one of the founders of the Gate Theatre in Dublin, one of the two founders. he had started his career to a large extent, at the Old Vic in London in the days of Lillian Bayliss. And when he was a very young actor and indeed opera singer at the Old Vic, some of the truly great influences on 20th century theatre, people like Gordon Craig, who was, you might almost call the founder of minimalist theatre design, Harley Granville Barker, who wrote brilliant commentaries on Shakespeare, but was a disciple of George Bernard Shaw and was the father of modern directors, as it were. And anybody who directs in the theatre today can trace that line back to Harley Granville Barker. So Hilton Edwards had a deep understanding of the nature of theatre structure, both from the 19th century, which he inherited, and the early part of the 20th century, of which he was one of the developers. He was my mentor. I bless the day I met him. Now, he taught me in conversation the very simple concept of what farce means, or of what makes us laugh. We laugh when others suffer. Simple, fundamental. Farce, this was a quote I learned from him. Farce is a tragedy happening to others. Tragedy is a farce happening to us. Farce only exists when somebody is in pain, however mild or severe that pain may be. It could just be mental anguish. It could be abject terror. It's usually not terrible physical suffering and torture. It's not that. But when somebody else is in pain for some reason or another, we find it funny. Without that, farce as a concept couldn't exist. Because farce, the reaction to farce, and it's a much broader definition than the usual convention one, and even the one that's in Wikipedia. Farce is part of the human condition, and it is the human condition upon which all art is based, and it is the human condition that makes us laugh and cry. So, remember that thought. Farce only exists when someone is in pain, however mild or severe that pain may be. Farce works as satire. Farce can be used as a method of satirizing those of different opinions, be they social, political, or religious. It's a bit like if you're on Facebook or Twitter and somebody says something that you consider politically, socially, or religiously abjectly stupid. You have two options. One is to say, I completely disagree with you, and the other is to say something satirical, funny, farcical, that shows up the stupidity of their argument. They can then do the same back to you to show up the stupidity of yours. In that way, we use an artistic concept in order to overcome our desire to go out and throttle people. So what exactly do I mean when I use the term farce? Well, farce is comedy. So first we have to define what is comedy. I mean, we all know the word, we all use the word all the time. We have a pretty good general idea of what the word actually means, and it comes in a multitude of forms. Now, the word comedy, I don't want to get into it, but the word comedy in terms of theatre, especially when you talk about, for instance, Shakespeare in theatre, comedy is something slightly more complex than just being funny. And that goes back to the Greeks, which I will come to. Let's go back to the beloved Wikipedia again. Comedy is a genre of fiction consisting of discourse or works intended to be humorous or amusing by inducing laughter. Yeah. The term originated, this is an interesting bit, the term originated in ancient Greece. In Athenian democracy, the public opinion of voters was influenced by political satire performed by comic poets in theaters. Isn't that wonderful? The public opinion of voters was influenced by political satire performed by comic poets in theatres. 2,500 years later, nothing has changed. We still use the platform that we have. It may not be public theatres, it may be this kind of platform, or Twitter, or any of the other things. But constantly, when political or religious figures put up a proposal, there are plenty of people out there willing to satirize it, to send it up, to make a joke of it, to laugh at the pomposity that is presented to them. That's the power of comedy. The theatrical genre of Greek comedy can be described usually, this is Wikipedia again, as putting two groups of societies against each other in an amusing conflict. And that's exactly what we still do today. Comedy has got a much broader reach than simply telling a joke. These two opposing sides in society have been described as the society of youth and the society of age. And that's still true today, generally, because most political arguments are either based on new thinking or old thinking, young people or older people. That separation of the new and the not so new usually is where the conflict comes in terms of any political thought, any social development or what have you. Those who like things the way they used to be, and those who dream of a time when it will all be different. And upon that conflict, you can have tragedy, you can have drama, you can have comedy. So, back to Wiki. A revised view characterizes comedy as a struggle, pain, between a relatively powerless youth and the societal conventions posing obstacles to that youth's hope. In this struggle, the youth is constrained by his lack of social authority and is left with little choice but to resort to ruses which engender dramatic irony, which provokes laughter. In other words, the new can defeat the old by being smart and outwitting them. And that was always, even in Commedia, that whole concept of Pantaloon, who has authority, power, money, what have you, being fooled into attitudes or behaviors that would normally be not acceptable to the character by a smart, clever youth. And I don't just mean youth as a person or age as a person, it is that concept. And it makes us laugh, because when we see pomposity or authority being diminished by cleverness, we may not agree with the cleverness, but it does amuse us. Now, much of Restoration and Victorian drama is based on that very idea, that taking a rise out of authority or power or money or what have you. Comedy, simply put, after all of that Wikipedia thing, comedy, very simply put, is just something that makes us laugh. We hear a joke and we laugh. For instance, I'll give you an example, and I credit my friend Quentin Reynolds for these jokes. They're his fault, not mine. For instance, the simple physical one. Two men walked into a bar. It hurt. Guess who I bumped into on the way to the eye doctor? Everyone. There's an implied physical distress in both those jokes, and yet we find them amusing. At least I hope you do. Otherwise, I'm going to lose a lot of audience. Here's another. If you lose one of your senses, the other senses are enhanced. That's why people with no sense of humor have a very heightened sense of self-importance. A political. A simple one, purely visual, the visual gag, but you've got to see it in your head as it's being told. I heard people are trying to ban Roman numerals. Well, not on my watch. It's And it's terrible. Here's one. Theatrical. I was kidnapped by a gang of mimes. They did unspeakable things to me. That's what it would describe as an intellectually aware joke. This one, I think, is one of my favorites pertaining to American politicians. Father said to his young son, "You know, you should be ashamed. When Abraham Lincoln was your age, he used to walk 10 miles every day to get to school." To which the son responds, "Really? When he was your age, he was president." This is a classic example of what I'm talking about, youth and age, that for youth to succeed, it must undermine the pomposity of the age factor. And that joke is a very simple and perfect example of it. The essence of what I'm going to now is to extend that thought. What is comedy? What is farce? Farce is not farcical if it is not comedic. But comedy does not need to be farcical. Farce is something different. It is something more extended. The essence of comedy, in that sense, is words. The essence of farce is action. This is my opinion, just reminding you. So you might say that comedy is the linguistic aspect of farce. So, why is a joke funny? If it is, why? Why is it funny? Fundamentally, it surprises us by the unexpected. It's rather like verbal prestidigitation, sleight of hand, card tricks, and what have you. But doing it with words. You set up a proposition that puts your mind in one particular direction, and then you slip in a simple phrase, a simple construct, or a simple action that completely undermines the proposition you've just put forward. And of course, added to that, you need the most essential skill that any actor can pray to be born with. And without it, all comedy is impossible, and that is timing. If you cannot deal with timing, because it is that trick of setting up a proposition and then unexpectedly undermining it. And if you expect the undermining, it isn't funny. And there is a corollary to that. There is that proposition of the setup. I'll mention that in a moment. I mentioned in that first Wikipedia quote the origins of farce and comedy, which goes way back. There were three Greek and Roman writers, poets, who would be described as the fathers of comedy as we understand it, and of farce. In fact, Aristophanes, the Greek, particularly known as the father of comedy. Now, Aristophanes in his plays, sort of to an extent, would recreate the world in which he lived within his plays. Everything was based on the life and behavior of the Athens of his times. And he did it probably better than any other of the Greek writers that we know of. His powers were powers of ridicule, exactly that point I'm making, the capacity to ridicule that which is accepted within society and to make us laugh at it, put up a proposition, undermine it, and we laugh at it. So they were, I think they were generally very frightened of him and the way he wrote his plays. He was very influential. It's written that Plato actually singled out Aristophanes. One of his plays considered it a slander that actually, didn't cause, but contributed to the trial and the eventual execution of Socrates by undermining the premise of not only of his philosophy, but of also his personal behavior. Aristophanes said that his audience, the audience he wrote for, the audience he wanted to appeal to, were the clever and the discerning. he was only writing for the smart-ass people. He wasn't writing for the common hoi polloi. And one of the things about his plays that is interesting, because it's this tiny reversal on the other point I just made, is that he was constantly ridiculing the new thinking, the new behavior, the new changes to the social order. And he would ridicule, in that sense, really important people in the arts and science, and, well, politics, philosophy, and what have you, such as Socrates, writers such as Euripides. You might call him the most conservative of new thinking writers. What he really did not like was the absurdities of newness rather than the certainties of experience. But he did write plays that laid a foundation for the principle that nothing is so important that it cannot be laughed at. Rome produced Plautus, and Plautus' sin, as far as authority was concerned, is that he wrote pieces that preached, and I'm taking a quote from Wiki again, indifference to and indeed encouraging of mockery of the gods. Now, at a time, let us remember, when Rome and Greece believed in a whole panoply of gods, even from Zeus or Jove at one end of the scale, down to the household gods that everybody had, the little private gods that they had. The gods were a major source of comfort and despair in both ancient Greek and particularly in ancient Rome. Plautus ridiculed that to an enormous degree. Any character in any of his plays could be compared to a god. And he did this in order to mock the whole concept. And he did it particularly by making sure, and this is a quote from authorities, however, when a character scorns a god, it is usually a character of low standing, such as a pimp. What he wanted to do, as one understands it, is to demoralize the characters through the art of satire. In other words, to take authority and to pinprick it, to deflate it by satire, by ridicule, by showing the absurdity, how farcical the concept of the godness was. And like a lot of other writers, he wasn't advocating change. He wasn't advocating new thinking. He wasn't advocating a political philosophy. He simply wanted to reflect and commentate on the very ideas that were going on in his time, that what authority says, what the official line is, and what the people, the ordinary hoi polloi, are actually thinking. And usually what the ordinary people are thinking is that everybody up there is highly pompous and highly stupid, and we could do it better. However, he did have to be very careful because in ancient Rome there was a considerable amount of state censorship. Terrence was the other one. Terrence is the third of my little group, and very much on the same lines as Plautus, but Terrence's comedies were far less physical. Plautus's comedies are very physical. By the way, funny thing happened on the way to the forum is based on the plays of Plautus. Terrence was slightly different. His comedies were much more about conversation. Simple, direct conversation. Visually, far less amusing. He didn't rely on sight gags. He relied very much on dialogue, on the idea of conversation. He also wrote much better plots, much purer language, and And the fact that his plots and his plays were cerebral rather than visual probably explains why he was far less popular. You might say that he was the he was the thinking writer of comedy. Plautus was much more the visual writer of comedy. But without the use of the sight gag, just using ideas and concepts, he had a very profound influence. Shakespeare used a lot of the classical themes that you can find in the plays of Terrence. And Shakespeare is the next perfect example of the comparison between farce and tragedy. Here's a thing I'm going to say that you won't agree with, or you may not. In each of Shakespeare's tragedies, there is always a strong element of farcical structure, of that concept of you set something up, you give it a credence, and then you pull the rug from under it. Even that notion, we use that phrase, pull the rug out. Why do we pull the rug out? So the person standing on it can fall over, in which case we then laugh. That's a simple farcical structure. The person walks through the door and the bucket of water drops on their head. It's a farcical structure. It's terribly dangerous, could cause severe brain damage, but we laugh at it. So Shakespeare does that. Shakespeare uses this simple concept and turns it on his head, and nobody can do it more brilliantly than Shakespeare. For instance, Shakespeare sets up a wonderful concept in the play Macbeth. He gives Macbeth absolute assurances. He tells Macbeth through the power of witches, of this mysterious world of Hecate and the witches. By magic power, he gives Macbeth absolute assurances of things that will happen, that he will become king, that he can be killed by no man born of a woman, and that he cannot fear until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane. Perfectly set up proposition for farce, because what happens? Exactly what they promised. He would become king, and he did. He would not be killed by anybody born of a woman, except that Macduff came by caesarean section, and that he need not fear until Birnam Wood to come to Dunsinane. And what does he look out of the window and see? Birnam Wood coming to Dunsinane. So there you have the use of a farcical structure right in the midst, right at the climax of a tragedy, but using that same principle that makes us laugh to make us cry, to make us worry, to make us concerned. Mind you, in Macbeth's case, the fact that everything goes wrong for him does tend to raise a bit of a laugh. King Lear, the greatest of all tragedies ever written. There you are. I've made a pejorative statement. I believe it to be true. The greatest of all plays ever written. Everything that can go wrong for Lear does go wrong until finally, having gone through all the horrors of the storm, all the unpleasantness of insanity, all the potential of fighting a battle on his daughter's side and then losing it, finally he comes face to face, hand to hand with the one daughter who truly loves him and finally discovers what love is and what happiness can be, and is content to be nothing but sit in a prison cell with his daughter until his days are done and everything could end happily ever after. So they hang her. That is a brilliant use of farcical structure, which is exactly the same as tragic structure, to undermine the proposition. In this case, it is tragedy. But viewed structurally, it is farce. It is nature having the last laugh, or humanity, or inhumanity, having the last laugh. Exactly that same structure. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic. We use that phrase. You may have used it yourself. God, that'd be funny if it wasn't so horrible. Because Farce just follows human nature, human behavior, just as tragedy do. Art is merely a reflection on ourselves, as 'twere a mirror up to nature. It's like that wonderful phrase that they used, I think, for the promo for the second Jaws movie, Jaws 2, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. And there you have it. That's tragedy, that's farce, summed up in a simple phrase. When you thought it was safe, it wasn't. When you thought you had it all under control, you didn't. When you thought you knew what was going to happen, you were wrong. Same structure. Back to Wikipedia again. The Restoration period, Restoration comedy, is an English, particularly in English, because it was the English restoration of the monarchy that caused it. In the period, and I'm quoting from Wiki again, from 1660 to 1710, was the period commonly known as the Restoration. Now, prior to the Restoration, there had been 18 years of what was essentially a republic in England. They had chopped off the head of the king, Charles I. Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector. He was king in everything but name. And you had a completely Puritan regime, and I mean with a capital P. These people made the inhabitants of Salem, Massachusetts look like a charity league. The suppression of everything that was pleasure, including Christmas. It was the Christians who banned Christmas. And of course, they shut down the theaters, naturally. Charles II, son of Charles I, had been residing in France. And he had grown to love theater, to love opulence, to love pleasures. When he was restored to the throne, he wasn't restored, the throne was restored and he was put on it. He brought back with him a whole new attitude towards theatre that had been developed out of the Italian commedia, a different physical theatre structure, but an attitude. In the post-Puritan period, the Restoration period, freedom was the order of the arts. Charles II himself actually encouraged sexually explicit language in the theatre, a thing that had been not particularly permitted under Elizabeth and James I and even Charles I, totally banned by the Puritans. Charles II brought it back because he believed in a freedom of expression in the arts. And the best known fact about Restoration drama is that it is immoral. And it's not simply that and I'm quoting again, dramatists did not criticize the accepted morality about gambling, drink, love, pleasure in general, or try even to work out their own view of characters and conduct. They didn't condemn or praise. They simply did was mock at any restraint on any of the above sins. The whole idea of their comedy was to say, it is free, we are liberated. As people, as artists, we can mock the pomposity that says such things as gambling, drink, love, pleasure generally is a bad thing. No, it's not. It's great fun, and let's enjoy laughing at it. Now, some of these plays were particularly gross, but most of them were again, as it's written in Wiki, delicately improper, a kind of nice naughtiness. If we were to look at it in terms of political correctness today, we would probably say, God, they were dreadful. Because the dramatists didn't just say, well, this is what I think. They gloried in it. And they did everything they could to shock people who didn't glory in it, didn't like it. The whole purpose of this kind of comedy was to shock. And that was done by, let me go back to that same proposition, the young and the old, the new and the aged, whatever way you want to call it, coming into constant conflict. The age having authority, the youth having determination. And in that conflict, the comedy would arise. But in this, it was profligacy, became the hero, and pomposity became the villain. Also, the important thing that happened in the whole Restoration period was a very, very important and, to my mind, vital addition to the growth of theatre. Women were allowed to play women. I think that was a great improvement myself. Very often, as I said, some of them were pretty gross, as described, daringly suggestive comedy scenes involving women became common. In other words, sex arrived on the stage for the first real time. And very often in these plays, women were the victims of sexual, not just marital, but sexual pursuit. I use the word with great care and in its original sense, but I think it was John Gay who wrote a play. There was a musical version of it called Lock Up Your Daughters, but the original play was called Rape Upon Rape. Rape in that sense was seduction, not the other thing. Even the Fantastics, that wonderful little musical that we all love, has a whole song about rape in that sense, about seduction. Very often the seduction would be forced, and that's where we lead to the other definition of the word. After that, but again, that same structure is being set up. Within all Restoration comedies, you will have characters of authority being subverted by the youthful idea, the youthful attitude, and we want to see that pomposity brought down a peg or two. And that's the farcical structure, because it is usually done by making the pompous look stupid. Not just sound stupid, but look stupid, putting them into attitudes worthy of ridicule. If you go on a little while, we move into the Georgian period. The great comedic writer of the Georgian period was unquestionably Richard Brinsley Sheridan, an Irishman. And what's important about him was that he followed not just the notions of the farcical concept, but also of the political concept. Because in spite of how famous a playwright he was and how brilliant a playwright he was an infinitely more brilliant and more influential politician. He used his plays. He also owned the Drury Lane Theatre. I think I'd mentioned him before when I talked briefly about him at the very start of the webinar series. He used his plays to make a commentary on the social and political mores of his time. He followed that principle of the farcical structure of pomposity defeated by youth. If you take his play The Rivals, it's simply a modern, for his time, which was the late 1700s, a modern take on the Restoration play. It was everything the Restoration play would have, but he based it on his own life, his own experiences, things that had happened to him, and turned and twisted them to create a play about the social order of the day and social behavior. Pomposity is destroyed hysterically in this play, and one of the most pompous characters in the play is the character of Mrs. Malaprop, the woman who cannot get the right word for anything and speaks of a longing to see the allegories of the Nile. She is a perfect example of that, the age being undermined by the youth. The ward she has, of whom she is guardian, will be seduced away from her by a scheming young man. And we want that to happen. His other play, another his play, School for Scandal, is a satire on the misconduct of the social and political world in which he lived, where in the political world, in the social world, scandal about you once engendered, could destroy your reputation forever. That once a reputation was destroyed, there was no way of getting it back. That's an eternal theme. Shakespeare talked about it when Iago says to Cassio, or Cassio says to Iago, my reputation, I've lost my reputation, I'm destroyed. It's a very common tragedy in all times, but Sheridan, in his writing, wanted to satirize not the victims of scandal, but the bitches who create it. And this play is a wonderful political observation using the structures of farce, setting up the pompous, undermining them. The hero of the play, the profligate brother. The villain of the play, the brother that everybody respects and regards for his purity of purpose and decency, who is in fact trying to seduce the wife of the other guy. And it is the profligate brother, the guy who believes in all those restoration qualities of naughtiness, that is the true hero. So you've got, again, that structure being set up: pomposity, youth, undermining. And we laugh. It is tragedy, in that sense, observed through the eyes of comedy. The Victorian melodrama, another example, which I always like to think of as a sort of gentle blending. It's a bit like, that thing on the recipe which says fold in the cream rather than stirring it, fold it in. And Victorian melodrama is like this gentle blending, this folding in of the tragic and the farcical. Melodramas always center on a victim. There is always a victim. The old, the girl who can't pay the rent, the wicked landlord who will take the rent, and the hero who will finally pay the rent. It's that kind of simple structure where there is a victim, there is a villain, and there is a hero. Usually, it's always a struggle between good and evil. You could have a young man being tempted away by a temptress of wicked determination, or a young girl being threatened by the advances of an evil uncle, stroke landlord, stroke whatever. You have characters in it like the fallen woman, the single mother, the orphan. The melodrama really is examining family issues. It's really examining a very ordinary level of society, but it is doing it using both farcical and tragic interchanges. That one moment you are laughing at something, and the next moment you realize this is appalling, and then the hero comes in, and we all laugh with joy again at the absurd way in which he managed to solve the problem. This blending of tragedy and farce. And always with melodrama and as with tragedy, we're always looking back to a better time. Oh, it was better in the old days. Well, no, it wasn't. In the late 19th and 20th century, and the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th, we moved into a period where farce as such became suppressed by a delight in polite comedy. And in much of this theatre of that late 19th, early 20th century, wordplay replaces the visual aspects of farce. We've gone much more towards Terrence and away from Plautus in that sense. You have, for instance, Oscar Wilde at the end of the 19th century, who's using wordplay to create amusement. I've done every one of Oscar Wilde's plays and directed every one of them as well. And out of all, people have often said, "What's the funniest line?" He said, "To my mind, it's the one of the funniest lines, and it never gets a laugh." And I know, because I've not only directed Maud's Being Earnest, but I played Lady Bracknell and various other characters. I never knew a person whose origin was a terminus. Now that is a cleverer and funnier joke than any of the ones I mentioned earlier. It is genius structure. It is using words for their power of absurdity. Noel Coward played similar games, but he would use them on a much simpler level, so that having set up a character with a particular name who immediately starts moaning about everything and has the other character say, "Don't quibble, Sybil," using simple repetition and rhyme to create something that is amusing. One of the lines that has never failed to get a laugh in any production ever of Private Lives is the moment when Elliot is leaving in the third act, put his hat on, his coat, and carrying a suitcase, and Amanda says to him, "Where are you going?" "Canada." Nobody knows why it's funny, but everybody laughs. The absurdity of language and sound has superseded, in this kind of comedy, the absurdity of physical behavior. But even Coward uses sexual infidelity, just like Restoration comedy, as a source for comedy. He uses the absurdities of infidelity as a farcical opening for of the first act for cross-coupling. And he wasn't alone in this, because the French farceurs, the great French farceurs like Feydeau, would do exactly the same thing. And in terms of, and again, I go back to my mentor, Hilton Edwards, and we remember discussing this years and years ago. What makes a farce, because it's a tragedy? A man decides to have an illicit weekend with his secretary. They go to stay in a hotel. What they do not know is that in the next room in the hotel, his wife, who has known he will be away, is now shacked up with their next door neighbor. That is tragic and very funny. This is the same principle that Noel Coward uses in Private Lives. You have the perfect opening act, as I say, for cross-coupling. Simple proposition. Elliot and Amanda have been divorced for some time. They both remarry. They both go on honeymoon. What they discover is that they are staying in adjacent suites on the same balcony of the same hotel for the same week. Tragic for their partners. Hysterically funny for us, especially when we realize that they are actually still in love, creating a much more structured, tragic, farcical situation. And always mixed with the use of divine words. I mean, again, you get these wonderful, absurd, almost farcical exchanges worthy of both Terrence and Plautus. Exchanges when they talk about what they did after they were divorced, went around the world. How was it? The world? Yes, very nice. How was China? Very big. And Japan? Very small. And this simple use of the construct of what I would describe as absurd exchange builds this farcical concept, because they fall in love again, they run off again, and we have everything as it should be. Until, of course, they spend a week together alone in a small Paris apartment. And we watch because we know it's going to happen. And this is what I mentioned earlier. Sometimes you do need to know what's going to happen for comedy, and particularly for farce, to occur. In the second act of Private Lives, when they're alone for such a period of time, they start talking. And when they start talking, they start finding disagreements. And the intellectual bickering eventually leads to a major physical punch-up between the two of them, which is what we expect to happen, what we want to happen, and when it does happen, when what happens confirms our expectations, we find it hysterically funny. We are looking at two grown-up adults battering the hell out of one another, and we're laughing. Marital violence is not funny, but we're laughing. We see it coming, and the action confirms our expectations, and we laugh not merely at the action, but at our own genius in predicting it. I know what's going to happen. Oh, I can see what's going to happen next. Oh, I know I knew that had happened. I said that. It's exactly that. And it gives us comfort. And in modern farce, exactly the same situation constantly occurs. And I know I'm going on about this, but I'm trying to prove my premise. You look at Neil Simon, Odd Couple. Look at the pain in the plot. Two men divorced, not easy, decide to share an apartment together. Smart thinking. And it is a marriage of unalike souls. The farce is of two men trying to survive in each other's impossible worlds. It is impossible for either of those men to survive in the world of the other. And all the way through that play, the genius of that play, one of the greatest American comedies ever written, the genius of that play is that we know it cannot work almost from the beginning. So each absurd moment that occurs simply confirms that we were right and that those two should not be living in the same apartment. Oh my God, he's not going to, yes. Oh my God, he's not said that. Oh yes. That's the genius of it. It is the perfect example of an ongoing, continual tragedy that is in fact farcical. The English writer, Alan Ayckbourn, one of the most successful writers of comedy that the British stage has ever seen. And particularly his early plays, this same principle occurs, and using very painful situations. One of the nicest is a play called Bedroom Farce. You have a proposition of four couples, but you see three bedrooms. And the major protagonist is a guy called Trevor, and you see the bedroom of his parents, very old-fashioned. The middle bedroom of his friends who have just moved, they're newlyweds, they've just moved into the house, and they're still doing the thing up. And the bedroom of his ex-girlfriend and her husband, and the whole thing is about a party that's happening in the house of the middle couple. In that, we see complete tragedy occur. For instance, the husband of the ex-girlfriend has done something severely bad to his back and he cannot move. He is constantly being pushed and thumped and pulled by his wife, and we laugh. The man is in agony. Left alone, he's reading a book, flicks the duvet on the bed, and the book falls on the floor. There is an entire scene of watching this poor, misfortunate man try to retrieve the book, fall onto the floor in total agony, in pain, almost crying with the pain kind of pain that we know all too well. But it's not happening to us, it's happening to him, and we find it funny. And all through that play, such propositions. He went even further with other plays. You have, for instance, a play called A Woman in Mind, which is somebody whose mind has, to a degree, gone, and we see two separate families around her. And we love the lovely family around her, but that isn't the real one. The real one is really unpleasant. And she is struggling between the two and trying to identify between the two. And we know which one we wish were real, and we know which one is, and eventually her mind accepts the one that is not real. That's tragic, but we're laughing. In a play called Just Between Ourselves, The Cruelty of Ignorance. Again, he uses these, and I'm not going to go into the plot, but he uses wonderful structures. A man trying for the first time to tell another man of just how awful his life is. But the other man is a DIY fanatic, and every time the confessing man opens his mouth, the listening man starts an electric drill. You laugh and you laugh and you laugh, and there's pain going on in front of you. There's a wonderful scene where they're having a tea party outside because it's a nice day, but the wife of the DIY guy is on the edge. She's beginning to crack. And in the course of the serving of the tea, she starts shaking, and the husband is laughing, and the friends are aghast, and the audience is laughing because we're seeing suffering from a remove. We see the absurdity and the cruelty of it, and we still laugh at it. I go one step further, nearly finished. Each one of Beckett's major plays is based on the principle, the same principle, the farcical reality of the tragedy of the human experience. Waiting for Godot. dreaming the impossible dream that Godot might come eventually. And all the antics, all the stupidities, all the behaviorisms that those two guys get up to, and all the silliness and the pomposity that the other two guys bring with them, Not So Unlucky. We laugh at it. Godot is a sublime comedy because it is tragic. Endgame. Endgame is probably his funniest and possibly his most tragic play. It is very, very funny right the way through. They are waiting for an end that doesn't happen. And we know, because they keep telling us, that they are waiting for an ending, but it is an ending, not an end. So they are trapped into a situation where they can consider and contemplate something coming to a conclusion that never will, that never does. It is yet again an absurdity that is both tragic and farcical because they follow exactly the same rules. The absurdity of the farce is always, in some sense, tragic for the protagonist. We see that tragic element, we watch it, we know it, and we delight ourselves that it's happening not to us, but to someone else. Hence, there is nothing funny about farce. Which brings me to the end of this week. Now, a little word about next week. And remember, if you have any comments, any questions, any queries, any worries, send me an email. We will get back to you with it. We always try to respond whenever possible, and we might be a bit late in responding, but we will get there and we will respond. And on this particular topic, because I think it's not controversial, I just think many people might disagree with me. But if you disagree, tell me. If you agree, I love you. Next week, we will be back, and we have our guest next week, which we're Aoife Spillane-Hinks, who was with us before, talking about John Millington Synge. She's going to be back again next week and talking about the other Irish folk playwright, John B. Keane. And we've done a couple of John B.'s plays. In fact, Aoife directed one of them, Sharon's Grave. We also did Scythe. And we're going to be talking about John B. as what you may say, the poet of poverty, the plays of poverty about John B. Keane, which I think are the natural successor to the plays of Synge. I think they fall in not only in that genre, but absolutely follow in terms of importance in Irish playwriting. So that will be next week. In the meantime, there's Aoife there, thank you. In the meantime, do take good care of yourselves. Do remember, by the way, if you want to sponsor a webinar, please let us know. Just send us an email. We'll send you the details. We're always eager to let you sponsor us. And if you, there's just a question come up there. Farcical elements to Beckett's Rockabye. Absolutely. There is a farcical element to it because it is ultimately tragic. And the farcical element is the inevitability of trappedness, that there is no escape. Yeah, there's a good question from Kay. I'll answer that one. Satirical comedy, is it important to understand society at the time in which it was written? Can such work stand the test of time? The answer to that is yes and yes. It does help if you know the social significance of the writing of comedy in the time it was written. Let's use Richard Brinsley Sheridan as a case in point. His plays were satires on his own society because he was a politician. He wrote what were essentially political satires. But the nature of the characters are so brilliantly drawn in the writing that whether or not you understand the politics, you understand the human frailty. A play retains its greatness not merely because it retains its political identity, but because it retains its social identity. And people are people are people. I've used the phrase before. the only things that ever change in the world are technology and fashion. And fashion tends to come round eventually. Technology is the only thing that really changes. So human nature does not change. If it did, we'd be a far better world. But unfortunately, human nature tends to remain on a single line. So we laugh at the humanity of the characters, even if we don't understand the political connection to it. So the answer to that is yes and yes. Are there never happy endings in farce? My reply to that one, Anne, is there ever a happy ending in life? A farce has happy endings. I think the answer is satisfactory endings. Yes, I'm not sure whether they're always happy. Yes. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for joining me. As I say, if you want to consider sponsoring a webinar, please just send us an email. We'll get back to you. If you want to send us a few dollars or euros or pounds or zlotys or whatever you have, always feel free to do so. We will never reject a donation. And in the meantime, follow the rules, wash your hands, wear your masks. I hope you get a vaccine very soon, and take very good care of yourselves. Bye for now.